The frozen ground tore at Freya's bare feet as she ran, each step leaving crimson prints in the snow that would lead them straight to her. She didn't care. Couldn't care. The only thing that mattered was the desperate rhythm pounding through her veins. Run, run, run. And the twins shifting restlessly beneath her heart, as if they too understood that death followed close behind. 3 moons. It had been 3 moons since she'd watched Magnus Shadowfang tear out Rowan's throat under a flag of truce. 3 moons since her gentle mate had bled out in her arms while Magnus stood over them both, smiling that cold smile she'd known since childhood. 3 moons of running, of hiding in abandoned dens and begging scraps from sympathetic Omegas, of pressing her hands to her swelling belly and promising her children that she would keep them safe, even if it killed her. Tonight, it very well might. "They're gaining on you," her wolf whispered, the voice that had been so silent since Rowan's death now trembling with fear. "We can't outrun them. Not like this. Not with the pups so heavy in our womb." Freya knew. Every breath burned like ice in her lungs, her body screaming for rest it couldn't have. 6 months pregnant and running through a winter forest in nothing but a thin shift. She was going to die out here, freeze to death if Magnus's hunters didn't catch her first, and her children would never draw breath, never know how much their father had loved them before they were even born. No. She stumbled over a hidden root, caught herself against a pine tree, bark scraping her palms bloody. "No, I will not let him take them. I will not let him win." Behind her, a howl split the night. Close, too close, and she recognized the voice. Garrett, Magnus's beta. The wolf who had held Rowan down while his alpha delivered the killing blow. The wolf who had laughed when Freya screamed. She pushed off from the tree and ran harder. The memory came unbidden, as it always did in her darkest moments. Rowan's kind eyes going dim, his hand reaching for her face, his last words a whispered "protect them, love them, live for them" before the light went out forever. She'd tried to die that night, had begged Magnus to kill her too, but he'd only smiled and said she was too valuable to waste. Said she'd always belong to him, would always belong to him. And once she'd whelped her bastard pups, he'd decide whether they were worth keeping, or if he'd dash their skulls against the stones. She'd run that very night, while Magnus celebrated his victory with wine and willing females, had crept out through the kitchens, stealing nothing but a cloak she'd lost somewhere in the first week, and had been running ever since. The howl came again, closer now, and another voice joined it. 2 of them, at least, maybe 3. She couldn't outrun an organized hunt, not in this condition, not when her body was failing her one frozen step at a time. The trees began to thin, and Freya's heart seized in her chest. Open ground ahead, a clearing, snow-covered and moon-bright, with nowhere to hide. Beyond it, a river cut through the landscape, ice-rimmed but flowing fast, and on the far bank she could see the dark shapes of evergreens marking territories she didn't recognize. She stopped at the clearing's edge, gasping, her hand pressed to her belly where the twins were kicking frantically. Her wolf stirred again, lifting its head with something that might have been hope. The Ashford border. "We're at the Ashford border." The realization hit her like a physical blow. The Ashford pack, ruled by the reclusive Alpha King Eric, the battle-scarred wolf who'd refused all mate bonds and kept his borders closed to outsiders for years. The rumors said he was a monster, that the scars on his face came from killing his own father, that he ate the hearts of wolves who trespassed on his land. But the rumors about Magnus had said he was honorable once. The rumors had said a lot of things. Better to die at the hands of an unknown monster than to let Magnus win, her wolf said grimly, and Freya couldn't argue with that logic. She ran. The clearing stretched endless before her, snow dragging at her feet, and behind her the tree line erupted with dark shapes, 3 wolves in pursuit, their eyes gleaming amber in the moonlight. Garrett's massive gray form led the pack, his jaws already parted in anticipation. "Little Luna," he called, voice echoing across the snow as he shifted to 2 legs, still running. "Your alpha wants you home, Stop this foolishness before you hurt yourself. Freya didn't waste breath on a response. The river was 30 feet away. 20. 10. She could hear Garrett's footsteps pounding behind her, could feel the heat of pursuit at her back. And then her feet hit the ice-slicked stones at the water's edge, and she threw herself into the current. The cold hit her like a hammer. Every thought, every sensation narrowed down to the crushing grip of the water, the ice forming in her veins, the babies twisting in her womb as if trying to find warmth that didn't exist. She couldn't swim, could only let the current take her, dragging her downstream and away from the monsters on the bank. "Hold on," she told her children, the only prayer she had left. "Hold on. Hold on. Please hold on." The river spat her out on the far bank, and she crawled on hands and knees through mud and snow, her body shaking so hard her teeth cracked against each other. Behind her, she heard Garrett's frustrated snarl, heard his companions shifting uncertainly as they paced the Ashford border they couldn't cross. "This isn't over, Freya!" Garrett's voice followed her into the darkness. "Magnus will come for you. He'll burn that scarred bastard's fortress to the ground if he has to, but he will have you back. You and those whelps both." She didn't look back. Couldn't look back. One hand in front of the other, knees scraping through frozen undergrowth, she crawled into the shadow of the Ashford pines and let the territory swallow her whole. She didn't know how long she crawled before the patrol found her. Time had become meaningless, measured only in the ragged pull of her breath and the dull throb of her frozen extremities. At some point, she'd stopped shivering, which some distant part of her mind knew was bad. Very bad. A sign that her body was giving up the fight. "The pups," her wolf whimpered, so faint now she could barely hear it. Save the pups. That was the only thought left in Freya's head when the wolves materialized from the shadows. 4 of them, massive and dark-furred, their amber eyes glowing as they circled her crumpled form. She tried to rise, tried to form words, but her body had finally betrayed her completely. All she could do was curl around her belly, protecting her children with the last of her strength, and wait for the end. Holy shit! One of the wolves shifted, revealing a young male with dark hair and wide eyes. "She's pregnant. She's really fucking pregnant and half dead. What do we do?" "We bring her to the Alpha." Another shift, an older female this time, her voice calm but urgent. "She crossed the border. She's on our land. That makes her our problem." "But the Alpha said—" "I know what the Alpha said." The female crouched beside Freya, her hand surprisingly gentle as it brushed frozen hair back from Freya's face. "He also said we protect the innocent." "Does she look like a threat to you?" The young male made a sound of uncertainty, but Freya didn't hear his response. The darkness was pulling at her, soft and seductive, promising an end to the pain and the cold and the fear. She fought it with everything she had left. "Please," she tried to say, though her lips wouldn't form the words. "Please, not for me. I don't matter. But my children, Rowan's children, they deserve to live. They deserve a chance." "Easy." The female's voice cut through the fog, sharp and commanding. "Easy, little mother. No one's going to hurt you. Can you tell me your name?" It took everything she had to force the word out. "Freya, Freya, Thornwood." The female's sharp intake of breath told Freya that the name meant something, but she couldn't hold on long enough to understand what. The darkness was winning, dragging her down into its depths, and the last thing she heard before unconsciousness claimed her was the female barking orders at her companions. "Get her to the fortress. Now. And someone fetch the healers. The Alpha's going to want to know about this." Freya dreamed of Rowan. They were in the meadow behind their little cottage, the one they'd planned to fill with children and laughter and all the quiet joys of a simple life. He was smiling at her, dark hair falling into his eyes the way it always did. That gentle smile that had made her fall in love with him despite Magnus's fury, despite the whispers of their pacts, despite everything that told her she was making a mistake. "You have to wake up, love," he said, and his voice echoed strangely as if coming from very far away. The babies need you to wake up. I can't. She reached for him, but her hands passed through his form like mist. I'm so tired, Rowan. I've been so tired for so long. I know. His smile turned sad, and she could see the wound at his throat now, the terrible gaping ruin of what Magnus had done to him. But you're stronger than you know, Freya. Stronger than he ever realized. And there's someone waiting for you. Someone who needs you as much as you need him. I don't understand. You will. He pressed a kiss to her forehead, and she could almost feel it, a ghost of warmth against her icy skin. Protect our babies, love, and let yourself be protected too. You've carried this burden alone long enough. Rowan, wait. But he was already fading, dissolving into golden light, and the meadow was dissolving with him, replaced by sensation. Warmth, blessed warmth, surrounding her like an embrace. Soft furs beneath her body, a fire crackling somewhere nearby, voices murmuring in low tones just beyond her comprehension. Wake up, her wolf urged, stronger now than it had been in months. Wake up, Freya. Something's coming. Something important. She opened her eyes. The room swam into focus slowly, high stone ceilings, tapestries depicting wolves in battle and in peace, firelight dancing across walls that spoke of ancient power and older blood. She was in a bed, larger than the entire cottage she'd shared with Rowan, covered in furs so soft they must have cost more than her father's entire yearly income. And she wasn't alone. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the torchlight from the hall beyond. Massive, taller than any wolf she'd ever seen, with shoulders broad enough to block the entire frame. She couldn't make out his features, just the suggestion of them, hard planes and harsh angles, but she could feel him. Oh gods, above and below, she could feel him. Warmth flooded her chest like summer sun breaking through ice, so sudden and so intense that she gasped aloud. Her wolf, that dormant creature who had barely spoken since Rowan's death, surged awake with a desperate keen that echoed through every fiber of her being. Mate. Mate. Mine. No. No, 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 this couldn't be happening. This wasn't possible. She carried another man's children in her womb, and her chosen husband was dead, had died in her arms 3 moons ago. She and Rowan had never felt the fated bond, had loved each other by choice, not cosmic design. Yet here she stood, feeling for the first time the very connection Magnus had mocked her for lacking. The figure stepped forward, into the light, and Freya saw his face for the first time. Scars. So many scars, raking across the left side of his features like claw marks, pulling at his eye and his mouth, and making him look like something from a nightmare. But his eyes were amber, burning amber. And as they met hers, they flashed molten gold, bright as the sun, bright as the mate bond blazing to life between them. A low growl rumbled from his chest, a sound that vibrated through her very bones. His massive frame went rigid, and she watched his hand shoot out to grip the doorframe, fingers digging into the wood hard enough to splinter it. "You're awake," he said, and his voice was rough like gravel, deep like the earth itself. "The healers said you might not—" He stopped, jaw clenching, as if the words had turned to ash on his tongue. Freya's hand flew to her swollen belly, where the twins were shifting as if they too felt the undeniable pull between their mother and this scarred stranger. This cannot be, she thought wildly, even as every cell in her body sang his name. I carry another man's children. I loved Rowan. I still love Rowan, and yet her wolf was howling with recognition, with longing, with a need so profound it threatened to swallow her whole. The Alpha King, for that was surely who he was. This battle-scarred monster who ruled the Ashford pack with iron and isolation, stood frozen in the doorway, his golden eyes fixed on her face like he was seeing something impossible. Something precious. Something that terrified him as much as it called to him. Neither of them spoke, neither of them moved. But the bond between them, new and raw and utterly undeniable, pulsed like a second heartbeat. And Freya knew with terrible certainty that nothing would ever be the same. The silence stretched between them, thick as the winter snow blanketing the world beyond these stone walls. Freya couldn't look away from him, from those golden eyes that seemed to pierce straight through to her soul, from the scarred face that should have frightened her, but instead made her wolf whine with an aching tenderness she didn't understand. Mate, her wolf whispered again, the word reverberating through her bones like a struck bell. Our mate. He's ours. But he couldn't be. The logical part of her mind, the part that had kept her alive through 3 moons of running and hiding and surviving, screamed that this was impossible. She had loved Rowan, still loved Rowan, would always love the gentle wolf who had given her everything, including his life. She'd never felt a fated bond before, not with Magnus, who had called her defective for it, and not even with Rowan, though their love had been no less real. So why now? Why this scarred stranger? And yet, the warmth spreading through her chest defied logic, defied grief, defied everything she thought she knew about wolf bonds and fate and the cruelty of the gods. It started at her heart and radiated outward, chasing away the lingering chill that had lived in her bones since she'd crawled out of that frozen river. Her skin tingled where the firelight touched it, hypersensitive, aware, as if her very body was reaching toward the massive wolf standing rigid in the doorway. Eric Ashford, the Alpha King, the scarred monster of 1,000 whispered warnings, hadn't moved. His hand remained locked on the splintered doorframe, knuckles white with the force of his grip, and his chest rose and fell with breaths that seemed deliberately controlled. The growl that had escaped him moments ago still echoed in the air, a sound that should have terrified her, but instead made something deep in her belly clench with an emotion she refused to name. You should be dead. His voice came out rough, almost accusatory. The healers said, when the patrol brought you in. He stopped, shook his head once like a wolf shaking off water. 3 days. You've been unconscious for 3 days. 3 days. Freya's hand pressed harder against her belly, panic spiking through the strange warmth. The babies are fine. The words came quick, almost gentle, and she watched something shift in his scarred face. The healer has checked them every few hours. Strong heartbeats, both of them. They're fighters, like their mother. Relief hit her so hard her eyes burned with unshed tears. She blinked them back, refusing to show weakness in front of this stranger, this impossible mate. This wolf who held her life and her children's lives in his massive scarred hands. Why? The question escaped before she could stop it. Your borders have been closed for years. Your people don't take in strays. Everyone knows that. So why save me? Eric's jaw tightened. For a long moment he didn't answer, just stood there studying her with those molten eyes that seemed to see far more than she wanted to reveal. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped to something almost soft. You begged. Freya frowned, trying to remember. The flight through the forest, the river, the cold. It all blurred together in a haze of desperation and failing strength. Not for yourself. He released the doorframe, took one step into the room, then stopped as if he'd hit an invisible wall. You were half dead, frozen to the bone, and you didn't beg for your own life. You begged for the children. Said they were all that remained of someone who loved them. His voice grew rougher. Said they deserved a chance to live even if you didn't. The memories surfaced then, fragmented and fever-bright. Hands on her face, a woman's voice asking her name, and her own desperate plea rising through the darkness. Please, not for me. I don't matter. But my children, Rowan's children, they deserve to live. I couldn't let you die after that. Eric's hands flexed at his sides, as if he was fighting the urge to reach for her. Couldn't let the pups die. What kind of alpha would I be if I turned away a mother willing to trade her life for her children's? A smart one, Freya thought bitterly. One who doesn't invite Magnus Shadowfang's wrath down on his pack for the sake of a stranger. But she didn't say that. Couldn't say anything, because he was still looking at her with those golden eyes, and every breath she took seemed to draw more of his scent into her lungs. Pine and winter storms and something darker, something wild, something that made her wolf pace in restless circles. She didn't realize she was crying until a tear slipped down her cheek, tracing a hot path over her cold skin. She swiped at it angrily, hating herself for the weakness, but another followed and another, and then she was sobbing with a grief she'd been too terrified to feel since the night Rowan died. "I'm sorry." She gasped the words out between sobs, unsure who she was apologizing to. Eric, Rowan, her unborn children, the mate bond she'd never asked for and didn't know how to face. "I'm sorry, I can't. You have nothing to apologize for." His voice was closer now. She looked up through tear-blurred eyes to find that he'd crossed the room, was standing beside the bed, close enough that the warmth radiating from his massive body reached her like a second fire. He hadn't touched her. His hands remained carefully at his sides, but his presence surrounded her anyway, a wall of strength and heat and inexplicable safety. "You survived," he said quietly. "You protected your young. You made it to my border when by all rights you should have died in those woods." Something flickered in his expression, there and gone too fast to name. "I don't want your apologies, Freya Thornwood. I want you to rest and heal. And tell me who put those shadows in your eyes so I can tear out their throat." The words should have been terrifying. This was the Alpha King, the monster of legend, and he was speaking of violence with the same casual certainty other wolves might discuss the weather. But all Freya felt was that inexplicable warmth spreading through her chest again, that pull toward him that defied everything she thought she knew. "Magnus Shadowfang," she whispered, and watched his eyes flash brighter gold at the name. "He killed my husband, Rowan. Killed him under a flag of truce because I refused to go back to Magnus, refused to let him claim me like I was still his property." Her voice cracked. "Magnus and we were betrothed when we were children. He rejected me when a higher-ranked female became available, but when I found Rowan, when I chose someone else, he couldn't stand it. Said I'd always belonged to him. Said Rowan was a thief who stole what was his." Eric's growl filled the room, low and rumbling and deadly. "And the children you carry?" "Rowan's." She placed both hands on her belly, as if she could shield her babies from the memory of their father's death. "Magnus said, when he killed Rowan, he said once I'd whelped my bastard pups. He'd decide whether they were worth keeping or if he'd—" She couldn't finish. Couldn't say the words. "He won't touch them." Eric's voice had gone flat, the kind of calm that preceded storms. "He won't touch you. As long as you're in my territory, under my protection, Magnus Shadowfang will have to go through me to reach you." A pause, waited. "And I don't go down easy." Freya stared at him, this scarred king who owed her nothing, who had every reason to throw her back across the border and avoid a conflict with a wolf like Magnus. The mate bond pulsed between them, that undeniable connection she couldn't explain and couldn't ignore, but she saw no calculation in his golden eyes. No expectation of payment or repayment, just a fierce, steady promise that settled something in her chest that had been screaming with terror for 3 solid moons. "Why?" she asked again, because she needed to understand, needed to know what kind of wolf he really was beneath the scars and the legend. "You don't know me, don't owe me anything. Why would you risk your pack's safety for a stranger and her unborn children?" Eric was silent for a long moment. His gaze dropped to her belly, to the swell of life beneath the furs, and something crossed his scarred face that looked almost like longing. "Because someone should have done the same for my mother," he said finally. "When my father turned on her, when he stopped, jaw clenching. It doesn't matter. Old history, old ghosts. What matters is that you're here now. And you're safe. And I don't go back on my word." He turned toward the door, and Freya felt the mate bond stretch between them like a physical thing, protesting the distance. Rest, he said, without looking back. I'll have food sent. We can talk more when you're stronger. Eric. He stopped at the sound of his name, shoulders tensing. Thank you. The words felt inadequate, laughably small against the enormity of what he'd done for her, but they were all she had. For saving us. For not making me explain why I deserve to live. He turned his head, showing her his scarred profile, and for just a moment his expression softened into something almost gentle. You don't have to explain that to anyone, Freya Thornwood. Least of all to me. Then he was gone, the door closing quietly behind him, and Freya was left alone with the fire and the furs and the startling warmth of a mate bond she never expected to feel. The food came an hour later, carried by a young serving girl who couldn't quite hide her curiosity as she laid out bread and cheese and a rich venison stew that made Freya's stomach growl loud enough to be embarrassing. The girl, Mira, she said her name was, chattered nervously about the weather and the fortress and how glad everyone was that the lady had woken up, and it took Freya several minutes to realize what was missing from the girl's chatter. Fear, judgment, suspicion. Mira treated her like an honored guest, not a disgraced widow who'd crawled across the border half dead with another wolf's children in her belly. But Mira was young, and young wolves didn't always share their elders' prejudices. Freya ate carefully, forcing herself to take small bites despite her ravenous hunger, and tried not to think about what would happen when the rest of the pack learned the truth about why she was here. The second day brought visitors. The healer, a gruff older female named Helga, who prodded Freya's belly with professional detachment and pronounced the twins strong as their mother, stubborn too, probably. And the patrol leader who had found her, a female named Sina, whose sharp eyes missed nothing but whose voice remained respectfully neutral. Neither of them mentioned Magnus. Neither of them mentioned the mate bond that Freya could still feel pulsing through her veins every time she thought of the Alpha King. Maybe they didn't know. Maybe the bond only worked one way, or maybe Eric had some way of masking it, hiding the unexpected connection from his pack. The thought should have been a relief. The last thing she needed was to be marked as the Alpha's mate while carrying another wolf's children. But instead, it left her feeling strangely hollow. He's protecting us, her wolf whispered. Protecting us from the judgment of his pack until we're strong enough to face it. Or maybe he wanted nothing to do with her. Maybe the bond was a mistake, a cosmic error that he intended to ignore until it faded away. Maybe. A knock at the door interrupted her spiraling thoughts. She pulled the furs higher over her shift and called out a hesitant "Enter," expecting Mira with another meal. Eric stepped through the doorway instead. He carried a tray in his massive hands, an absurd sight. This scarred giant of a wolf balancing bread and fruit, and what looked like fresh honey as if he were a common servant. Freya stared at him, mouth slightly open, as he crossed the room and set the tray on the bedside table with surprising grace. The kitchens were busy, he said gruffly, not meeting her eyes. I was passing by anyway. The lie was so transparent that Freya almost laughed. From what she'd seen of this fortress, the Alpha's quarters were nowhere near the kitchens, and even if they were, no pack leader she'd ever known would carry food to a guest's room like a serving boy. You don't have to, she started, but he cut her off with a sharp gesture. Eat. You're still too thin. He hesitated, then pulled a chair from the corner of the room and positioned it at a careful distance from the bed. When he sat, the chair creaked ominously under his weight, and Freya had to bite the inside of her cheek to keep from smiling. She ate in silence, acutely aware of his gaze on her face. The food was good, better than anything she'd tasted in months, and her body responded to the nourishment with an almost pathetic eagerness. The twins shifted and kicked as she ate, and she pressed a hand to the spot where a tiny foot, or was it a hand, pushed against her belly. They're moving. She said it without thinking, then flushed when Eric's eyes dropped to her belly with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "Does it hurt?" The question was so unexpected, so oddly tender, that she blinked at him for a moment before answering. "No, it feels like bubbles, sometimes, or like they're doing somersaults in there." She tried to smile. Rowan used to talk to them every night, said he wanted them to know his voice. The words came out before she could stop them, and she immediately wished she could take them back. This wolf, this fated stranger, didn't need to hear about her dead husband, didn't need to be reminded that the children she carried belonged to another male. But Eric just nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "He sounds like he was a good man, a good mate." "He was." Freya's throat tightened. "He was kind and gentle, and he made me laugh. Magnus thought that made him weak, but Rowan was the strongest wolf I ever knew, because he was brave enough to be soft in a world that demanded hardness." "Softness isn't weakness." Eric's voice was quiet, rough. "My mother used to say that. She said the wolves who scared her most weren't the ones who snarled and snapped, but the ones who could kill without blinking and still be gentle with a pup." Freya studied his scarred face, trying to reconcile the monster of legend with the wolf who sat in her sick room talking about his mother's wisdom. "The rumors say you killed your father, that the scars came from the fight." She expected him to flinch or snarl or tell her it was none of her business. Instead, he just met her gaze with those molten eyes and said, "The rumors are right. About the killing, at least. The scars." His jaw tightened. "Those came from what he did to my mother, before I was old enough to stop him." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Freya remembered what he'd said yesterday. Someone should have done the same for my mother. And suddenly the pieces clicked into place. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I shouldn't have." "You have a right to know what kind of wolf is offering you protection." Eric's voice was flat, emotionless, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the arms of the chair. "My father was cruel. He hurt my mother for years, hurt her in ways I was too young to understand. When I got old enough and strong enough to challenge him, I did. And when he was on the ground bleeding out, I made sure he'd never hurt anyone again. That's not murder, that's justice." The words came out fierce and sure, and Eric's eyes widened slightly as if he hadn't expected her response. Most wolves would say it was patricide, an unforgivable sin. Most wolves didn't have to watch their mother suffer. Freya held his gaze, refusing to look away. Most wolves don't understand what it means to be helpless against someone who's supposed to protect you. She thought of Magnus, of Rowan's blood on the snow, of 3 moons of running and hiding and praying her children would survive. You did what you had to do. Anyone who can't see that isn't worth listening to. Something shifted in Eric's expression, a crack in the careful blankness he wore like armor. For just a moment she saw the boy he must have been, the young wolf who had killed his own father to save his mother, who had earned those terrible scars and worn them ever since as a reminder of what he'd survived. Then the mask was back, and he was rising from the chair, clearing the empty dishes from her tray with movements that seemed too domestic for such a massive wolf. "You should rest more." His voice was gruff again, controlled. "The healer says another few days of bed rest, then you can start walking the halls if you feel strong enough." "Eric." She caught his arm as he passed, her fingers barely spanning the thick muscle of his forearm. The contact sent a jolt through her. That mate bond again, pulsing with warmth and recognition, and she saw his eyes flash gold before he got himself under control. "Thank you. For the food. For sitting with me. You didn't have to." "No," he agreed quietly. "I didn't." But he had, and they both knew what that meant, even if neither of them was ready to say it out loud. The council meeting came on her 4th day in the fortress. Freya hadn't wanted to attend, had in fact begged Helga to tell Eric she was too weak to leave her room, but the healer had just shaken her head and said, "The Alpha's orders. You're to be there so the elders can see you're no threat to the pack." So here she was, dressed in borrowed clothes that hung loose on her diminished frame, standing before a semicircle of hard-eyed wolves who looked at her swollen belly like it was an insult. Eric sat at the head of the council table, his scarred face impassive, but Freya could feel his attention on her like a physical weight. The mate bond hummed between them, that inexplicable connection that hadn't faded despite the days of careful distance between them. The Thornwood widow, an older male, silver-haired and sharp-featured, spoke with barely concealed disgust. Carrying another pack's whelps. Tell me, Alpha, do you intend to make us nursemaids to every stray female who wanders across our border? Watch your tone, Elder Marcus. Eric's voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. The Lady Freya is my guest. She will be treated with respect. Respect? Another elder, a female with cold eyes and a harder mouth, laughed humorlessly. She brings Magnus Shadowfang to our doorstep and you speak of respect? If the rumors are true, if she truly was his rejected betrothed, he will stop at nothing to reclaim her. You would risk our pack for the sake of a woman you've known for days? I would protect any innocent who came to me for sanctuary. Eric's jaw tightened. That is what an alpha does. Or have you forgotten the oaths you swore when I took this throne? The elders shifted uncomfortably, but the silver-haired male, Marcus, wasn't finished. He rose from his seat, pointing a gnarled finger at Freya's belly with open contempt. And what of those? Will you foist another wolf's whelps on our pack? Raise them as if they belong here? Bad enough to shelter the mother, but the children? Enough. The word cracked through the room like thunder, and Freya felt the mate bond flare between her and Eric as his alpha power surged outward. Every wolf in the room dropped their eyes, including Marcus, whose weathered face had gone pale. Eric rose to his full height, 7 feet of scarred fury and barely leashed violence, and when he spoke, his voice was the growl of a wolf defending his territory. The children she carries will be born in safety. That is not burden. That is gift. His golden eyes swept the room, daring anyone to challenge him. Any wolf who disrespects my guest disrespects me, and you all know what happens to wolves who disrespect me. The silence that followed was absolute. Freya stood frozen, one hand pressed to her belly where the twins were kicking frantically, as if they too sensed the power crackling through the air. No one moved. No one breathed. Then Marcus lowered his head, the gesture of submission unmistakable. Forgive me, Alpha. I spoke out of turn. You did. Eric's voice remained cold. See that it doesn't happen again. He moved then, crossing the room to Freya's side with that predator's grace that seemed at odds with his massive frame. His hand came up. She tensed. Couldn't help it. But all he did was cup her elbow, the touch gentle despite the strength she could feel coiled in his fingers. You're pale, he murmured, low enough that only she could hear. The healer said you shouldn't be on your feet too long. I'm fine. The lie was automatic, even as her legs trembled beneath her. I don't want to seem weak in front of... You could never seem weak. His golden eyes met hers, and she saw something fierce in their depths. Something protective and possessive, and terrifying in its intensity. But you're carrying 2 lives, and I won't have you collapsing to prove a point to wolves who don't deserve your strength. He guided her out of the council chamber, his hand never touching more than her elbow, but she could feel the warmth of his body like a shield between her and the stares of the elders behind them. No one followed. No one dared. You didn't have to do that, she said when they were in the corridor, her voice shakier than she wanted it to be. Marcus isn't wrong. I am putting your pack at risk. Magnus will come for me. Let him come. Eric stopped walking, and she looked up into his scarred face to find an expression she hadn't seen before. Not the careful blankness, not the gruff gentleness, but something raw and hungry and utterly resolved. Let him bring his army and his threats and his claim to a woman who was never his to begin with. His voice dropped, rough as gravel. You chose Rowan. You loved Rowan, and now... He cut himself off, jaw working, as if fighting back words he wasn't ready to say. "Now you're mine," her wolf whispered, and she didn't know if it was her thought or his, bleeding through the bond. Mine to protect, mine to cherish, mine. "Eric, you should rest." He released her elbow, stepped back, and she felt the distance between them like a physical ache. "I'll have Mira bring you dinner." "You won't?" She bit her tongue, hating how small her voice sounded, how much she'd come to depend on his presence in just a few short days. "Will you sit with me? While I eat?" The question hung between them, weighted with meaning neither of them was ready to acknowledge. Eric's scarred face was unreadable, but she saw his hands flex at his sides, saw the way his chest rose with a carefully controlled breath. "If you want me there," he said finally, "I'll be there." It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a promise. But as Freya walked back to her room with the memory of his touch still warm on her elbow, she realized that her guard, that wall of grief and fear she'd built around her heart since Rowan's death, had started, ever so slightly, to come down. And for the first time in 3 moons, that didn't terrify her as much as she thought it should. The following days passed in a strange rhythm that Freya hadn't expected. Eric came to her room each evening as he'd promised, bringing with him the scent of pine and winter storms that had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. He sat in the chair by her window while she ate, his massive frame somehow making the sturdy oak look fragile, and they talked. Or rather, she talked. About Rowan, about the twins, about the life she'd built before Magnus had torn it all apart. And Eric listened with an intensity that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't since her mate's death. "He loved the stars," she said one evening, her hand resting on her belly where the twins were quiet for once. "Rowan. He used to wake me in the middle of the night when the sky was clear, wrap me in furs and carry me outside so we could watch them together. He knew all their names, all their stories." Eric's golden eyes caught the firelight and she saw something flicker in their depths. "He sounds like a good man." He was. The words didn't hurt as much as they used to. "He was gentle and kind and he loved me even though I was—" She stopped, the old shame rising in her throat. "Even though you were what?" Freya looked down at her hands, at the slight tremor in her fingers. "Magnus and I were betrothed from birth. A political alliance between Thornwood and Shadowfang. But when I came of age and neither of us felt the fated mate bond, he rejected me publicly. Called me defective. Said there had to be something wrong with me for the moon goddess to deny us our bond, as if I alone were to blame." She forced herself to meet Eric's eyes. "Rowan was there that night. He saw Magnus humiliate me in front of 3 packs, and he didn't care. He asked to court me anyway, told me that chosen love could be just as sacred as fated bonds, that he'd seen something in me worth cherishing. We never felt that mythic pull everyone talks about, but what we had was real." Her voice cracked. "I thought I was so lucky. I thought—" Her voice broke, and she pressed a hand to her mouth to hold back the sob. The chair creaked as Eric rose. She expected him to leave, to give her privacy in her grief. But instead, she felt him kneel beside her, his massive body folding down until his scarred face was level with hers. He didn't touch her. He never touched her unless she initiated it, but his presence was a warmth she could feel through her entire body. "Magnus was a fool," he said, his voice rough. "The mate bond isn't—" He stopped, his jaw tightening. "It isn't the only way to know someone's worth. And rejecting you said everything about his failures, not yours." She wanted to believe him. Gods, how she wanted to believe him. "But I'm mated to you now," she whispered, and the words hung in the air between them, heavy with all the things they'd been carefully not saying. "The bond is there, and we didn't choose it, and I'm carrying another man's children, and you shouldn't—" "Freya." Her name in his mouth was a command and a plea at once. "Stop." She fell silent, her heart pounding. "I didn't choose the bond," he said slowly, as if each word cost him something. "But I'm not sorry it's you." His golden eyes blazed, and she felt the truth of his words pulse through the thread that connected them. I've spent 20 winters refusing to let anyone close. I've told myself that bonds were weakness, that caring for someone gave your enemies a weapon against you. And then you collapsed at my border, half dead and full of fight, carrying children you'd die to protect. And I. He cut himself off, breathing hard. You what? She breathed. Eric's hand rose, hesitated. And then, so gently she barely felt it, his fingers brushed a strand of hair from her face. I knew, he said. Before the bond even snapped into place, I knew you were going to change everything. The fire crackled in the silence. Outside, wind howled through the mountain pass, but here, in this room, there was only warmth and the impossible reality of what was growing between them. I'm not whole, she said, because he deserved the truth. Part of me will always belong to Rowan. Part of me will always be... I know. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone, feather light. I'm not asking you to forget him. I'm not asking you for anything you're not ready to give. His voice dropped, roughened with emotion. But I need you to know that whatever you are willing to give me, I'll treasure it. And those children. His eyes dropped to her belly, where the twins had begun to stir at the sound of his voice. They'll be mine, Freya. Not because of blood or bond, but because they're part of you. And you're... He stopped again, and she saw the fear in him then, the vulnerability that lurked beneath all that power and protective fury. He'd spent his life building walls just like she had, and now those walls were crumbling for both of them. I'm what? She asked softly. But before he could answer, the door burst open. Garrett stood in the doorway, his face pale beneath his beard, and the words that came from his mouth shattered the fragile peace they'd been building. Alpha. A messenger just crossed the border. Magnus Shadowfang is 2 days away, with an army at his back. The change that came over Eric was instant and terrifying. One moment he was kneeling beside her, vulnerability softening the hard lines of his face. The next he was on his feet, his body radiating power that made the hair on Freya's arms stand on end. His eyes blazed pure molten gold, and the growl that rumbled from his chest was the sound of a wolf ready to tear worlds apart. How many? His voice was barely recognizable. 300 by the scouts' count, maybe more. Garrett's jaw was tight. And Alpha, he's not just from Shadowfang. He's brought wolves from Ironmaw and Stormridge. He's calling it a coalition. Freya's blood turned to ice. 300 wolves. 3 packs united against one. And all because of her. He's claiming the king stole a pregnant widow as provocation for war, Garrett continued. Says he's coming to return the stolen property to its rightful pack and... He hesitated, his eyes flicking to Freya with something that looked like pity, and to deal with the bastard offspring she carries. The world narrowed to a single horrifying point. Magnus wanted her children dead, not just her. Her babies. Rowan's last gift to the world. No. The word ripped from her throat, raw and desperate. No, you can't let him. I'll go. I'll leave. You'll do nothing of the sort. Eric's voice cut through her panic like a blade. He turned to her, and the fierce protectiveness in his eyes made her breath catch. You are under my protection, Freya. You and your children. Magnus Shadowfang can bring his army and his lies and his demands, but he will not touch you. Not while I breathe. But 300 wolves? I have 400 who will fight for their alpha. His lip curled back from his teeth. And they've been spoiling for a war since Magnus started spreading his poison. Let him come. The words echoed what he'd said days ago, but now they held a different weight, the weight of a king preparing for battle. Garrett, call the war council. I want every warrior on high alert and our borders fortified by nightfall. Yes, Alpha. Garrett turned to go, then paused. What about the message, Alpha? Magnus is demanding a parley before any action. Says he wants to negotiate a peaceful resolution. Freya's wolf snarled inside her at the word. Peaceful. Magnus didn't know the meaning of peace. He'd murdered Rowan under a truce flag, slit her mate's throat while speaking words of reconciliation, and then tried to claim her like property while her mate's blood was still wet on the ground. A parley, Eric repeated, something dangerous flickering in his eyes. Don't go. The words were out before Freya could stop them. She grabbed his arm, her fingers barely spanning the thickness of his forearm, and she felt the muscle bunch beneath her grip. Please, Eric. He killed Rowan at a parley. I know what he did. Eric's hand covered hers, his warmth seeping into her chilled fingers. But refusing a parley gives him the high ground. He can claim I was the aggressor, that I wanted war. His jaw tightened. I have to go. Then let me come with you. Absolutely not. He wants me, Eric. He's brought an army for me. If you're there, he might try to take you by force. Eric's grip on her hand tightened almost painfully. Freya, you're 6 moons pregnant with twins. You can barely stand for more than an hour without exhaustion, and your wolf... He stopped, something shifting in his expression. My wolf what? He was silent for a long moment. Your wolf is different, he said finally. Stronger than you know. But she's been dormant since Rowan's death, and pushing her now, with the pregnancy. It could harm you. All 3 of you. Freya felt the truth of his words even as she wanted to deny them. Her wolf had awakened when she'd seen Eric in that doorway, had surged toward him with desperate recognition, but since then she'd been quiet again, a sleeping presence in the back of Freya's mind. Not gone, not exactly, but waiting, as if gathering strength for something. I won't hide while you face him, she said. I won't be a coward. You are the furthest thing from a coward I've ever met. Eric's voice softened, and he lifted her hand to press a kiss to her knuckles, a gesture so unexpectedly tender that her heart clenched. You ran for moons with hunters on your trail. You collapsed at the border of a stranger's territory and begged for your children's lives, not your own. You faced my counsel and stood your ground when any sensible person would have crumbled. His golden eyes held hers. But bravery is not the same as recklessness, and I need to know you're safe, or I won't be able to think clearly. Magnus is counting on that, counting on using you against me. Don't give him that weapon. She wanted to argue. Every instinct screamed at her to fight, to stand beside her mate and face their enemy together. But the twins chose that moment to kick. Hard. And she remembered that she wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. Promise me you'll come back, she whispered. Something flickered in Eric's eyes. Surprise, maybe. Or wonder. I'll come back. Promise me. He leaned down, and for one heart-stopping moment she thought he was going to kiss her. But his forehead came to rest against hers instead, his breath warm on her lips, and she felt the bond between them pulse with 100 unspoken words. I promise, he said, his voice rough. I will always come back to you. And then he was gone, striding out the door with Garrett at his heels, leaving Freya alone with the fire's crackle and the terrifying knowledge that everything she'd found here, this fragile hope, this unexpected sanctuary, this impossible bond, might be torn away before she ever had the chance to fully claim it. The hours that followed were the longest of Freya's life. She paced her room until her ankles ached, then sat by the window and watched the fortress transform into a war camp. Warriors streamed through the courtyard below, checking weapons and reinforcing gates. She could hear the shouts of commanders, the ring of steel, the howls of wolves running patrol on the borders. Everyone was preparing for battle, everyone except her, trapped in this room like a bird in a gilded cage. Mira came with dinner, her round face creased with worry. You should eat, lady. For the little ones. Has there been word from the Alpha? Not yet. Mira set the tray on the table, her hands trembling slightly. But Alpha Eric is the strongest wolf in 5 territories. He'll what? Freya asked sharply. Defeat an army single-handedly? Kill Magnus with words alone? Mira's face crumpled and Freya immediately felt guilty. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Mira. I'm just frightened, Mira finished, compassion softening her features. As am I, lady. As is everyone. She hesitated. But I've served this fortress for 30 winters, and I've never seen the Alpha like this. Not since his mother. She stopped, pressing her lips together. His mother what? The older woman shook her head. It's not my story to tell. But I will say this. Alpha Eric has walls around his heart that make your fortress walls look like paper. For him to let anyone in, to show the care he's shown you. Her eyes glistened. It means something, lady. It means everything. After Mira left, Freya tried to eat, but the food turned to ash in her mouth. She kept thinking about Eric's face when he'd promised to return, about the way his forehead had pressed against hers, about the raw hunger in his voice when he'd said she was going to change everything. She kept thinking about Magnus. She'd known him since childhood, had grown up being told she would be his Luna, his mate, his partner in all things. She'd tried so hard to love him, to force feelings that wouldn't come no matter how much she wanted them to. And when the bond had failed to snap into place on her 18th birthday, when she'd stood before him and felt nothing but hollow disappointment, he'd turned on her like she'd planned it. Defective, worthless, an embarrassment to the Thornwood line. His words still echoed in her nightmares. But the worst part, the part that haunted her most, was that she'd almost gone back to him. After Rowan's death, when she was numb with grief and heavy with pregnancy and utterly alone, Magnus had sent messengers promising forgiveness, promising protection, promising that all would be forgotten if she just came home and took her proper place at his side. She'd almost believed him. It was only when the messengers let slip their true purpose, that Magnus wanted the twins dealt with before they could threaten his claim to Thornwood territories, that she'd run. And she'd been running ever since, until she'd collapsed at Eric's border and found something she'd never expected to find again. Hope. The crash of glass shattered her reverie. Freya spun toward the window just as a massive black wolf exploded through it, sending shards of glass scattering across the floor like deadly rain. She screamed, throwing her arms up to protect her belly, but the wolf was already shifting, bones cracking and reforming until a man stood before her. A man with Magnus Shadowfang's cruel eyes and Magnus Shadowfang's triumphant smile. "Hello, little Freya," he said, his voice silk over steel. "Did you think running to the scarred king would save you?" Terror turned her blood to ice. "How? The patrol?" "Your precious Alpha is 2 miles away, thinking he's meeting me at the border for a parley." Magnus took a step closer, glass crunching beneath his boots. "My wolves created quite the diversion at the eastern gate. Enough chaos to pull every warrior away from this wing. The old servant tunnels beneath the fortress? Your mate really should have sealed those when he took power." His smile widened. "But I'm not at the border, am I? And by the time he realizes he's been tricked, you and I will be long gone." Freya backed away until her shoulders hit the wall. Her hand went to her belly, to the twins who were kicking frantically now, sensing her fear. "I won't go with you. You don't have a choice." Another step. His smile widened, showing teeth that were still too sharp, still too wolf. "You were promised to me, Freya. You were supposed to be mine. And then, you let that pathetic excuse for a wolf touch what belonged to me. Let him put his pups in your belly." His face twisted with fury. "Do you have any idea how that looked? Magnus Shadowfang's betrothed, spreading her legs for a nobody with no pack and no power? I was never yours." Her voice shook, but she forced the words out anyway. "The bond didn't—" "The bond." He spat the word like a curse. "I don't care about the bond. I cared about the alliance, the power, the bloodline." He was close enough now that she could smell him. Smoke and blood, and something rotten underneath. "But don't worry. After I've dealt with those little abominations you're carrying, I'll put proper pups in you. Pups with Shadowfang blood. and you'll learn to be grateful for my mercy." Something snapped inside Freya. Later, she wouldn't be able to explain it. Wouldn't be able to describe the feeling of her wolf, dormant for so long, suddenly roaring to life with a fury that burned through every vein, every nerve, every cell of her body. The room seemed to brighten. Or maybe she was the one growing brighter, silver light streaming from her skin like moonlight made flesh. Magnus staggered back, his confident sneer faltering. "What? You killed Rowan!" Her voice came from everywhere and nowhere, resonating with power she hadn't known she possessed. "You murdered my husband under a flag of truce. You hunted me for moons. And now you dare threaten my children?" The light intensified, and she felt something ancient stirring in her blood. The Thornwood legacy, passed from Luna to Luna for 100 generations, awakening at last. "You will not touch them." The room shook with her words. "You will not touch me, and you will not touch my mate." Magnus lunged at her, his form blurring as he shifted mid-leap, but Freya threw out her hand, and the silver light caught him, held him suspended in midair, his wolf form writhing and snarling but unable to move. She had no idea how she was doing this. She had no idea how long she could hold him, but she knew, with perfect certainty, that Eric was coming. "Freya!" His roar shook the walls as he burst through the door, Garrett and a dozen warriors at his back. His eyes took in the scene, the broken window, the floating wolf, Freya blazing like a silver star, and his face went rigid with a fury that made Magnus's rage look like a child's tantrum. "He came for me," Freya gasped, the power flickering as exhaustion crashed over her. "Through the window, it was a trap, the parley." "I know." Eric crossed the room in 3 strides, his hand coming up to cup her face as his eyes searched hers. "I felt it. I felt your fear through the bond, and I—" His voice broke. "Are you hurt?" "The twins. We're fine." The silver light was fading now, her strength with it. "But I don't know how much longer I can— Let him go." Eric's voice was death itself. "I'll handle him." Freya released her hold on Magnus, and the black wolf crashed to the ground, immediately shifting back to human form. He scrambled to his feet, but 4 warriors were on him instantly, forcing him to his knees with silver-laced chains that made him howl with pain. "You can't do this," Magnus snarled, struggling against his bonds. "I came under parley." "You came through my mate's window like a thief in the night," Eric cut him off. "Parley protections don't apply to assassination attempts." He stalked toward Magnus, and Freya saw his claws extending, his eyes burning pure gold. "You killed her mate. You hunted her for moons. And now you dared put your hands on what's mine." The world tilted. Freya's knees buckled. The last thing she heard before darkness claimed her was Eric's voice, roaring her name with a terror that told her everything she needed to know about how much she'd already come to mean to him. Freya woke to warmth, and the steady rhythm of a heartbeat beneath her ear. For a moment, she didn't understand where she was or how she'd gotten there. The last thing she remembered was silver light streaming from her fingers, Magnus suspended in midair, and then Eric's face, his eyes wild with terror as he caught her before she hit the ground. She was in his arms. That much became clear as awareness seeped back into her body. He was sitting on the floor of her chamber, his back against the wall, cradling her against his chest as if she were something precious, something fragile, something he couldn't bear to let go. Her head rested in the hollow of his throat, and she could feel the rapid pulse of his blood against her temple. "Freya." His voice was raw, scraped down to something beyond words. "Freya, please. Open your eyes. Tell me you're—" "I'm here." The words came out as barely more than a whisper, but she felt his entire body shudder with relief. "The twins. They're fine." She pressed her palm to her belly, felt the answering flutter of movement. "They're strong. They're fighters." A weak laugh escaped her. Like their father was. Eric's arms tightened around her, and she felt his lips press against her hair, a kiss so gentle it made her chest ache. "Like their mother is," he corrected. What you did. The power you wielded. I've never seen anything like it. Freya struggled to sit up, and he helped her, keeping one massive arm around her waist to steady her. The room was empty now, except for them. The broken window had been covered with heavy canvas, blocking the cold night air, and the glass had been swept away. But she could still smell the lingering traces of smoke and blood, Magnus's scent, a stain on her sanctuary. "Where is he?" she asked. Eric's jaw tightened. "In the dungeon, chained with silver and guarded by my best warriors." "He killed Rowan." The words tumbled out, 3 moons of grief and rage finally given voice. Under a flag of truce. Rowan went to negotiate peace and Magnus cut him down like he was nothing, like he didn't matter. "I know." Eric's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing away tears she hadn't realized she was shedding. "The warriors who found you at the border? They told me what Magnus did, what you survived to escape him." "I ran." Shame burned in her throat. "I should have fought. Should have. You protected your children." His voice was fierce, brooking no argument. "You survived. You made it here. That took more courage than 1,000 battles." Freya leaned into his touch, drawing strength from the bond that pulsed between them. Stronger now, more solid, as if her display of power had somehow cemented what had been forming since she first opened her eyes to find him watching over her. "The power," she said slowly. "I didn't know I had it. I didn't know." "The Thornwood Luna legacy." Eric's eyes were soft with something that looked almost like awe. "I've heard stories. Every Luna of the Thornwood line carries the potential, but it only awakens when... When what?" He was quiet for a long moment. "When she has something worth protecting beyond herself. When she takes a true fated mate bond, not an arrangement or an alliance, and faces a threat so dire the power has no choice but to rise." His scarred face twisted with old pain. "The prophecies said I would know my mate by her silver light. I thought it was metaphor. Poetry. The kind of thing dreamers believe in. But it wasn't. No." He pressed his forehead to hers, and she felt the trembling in his massive frame. This warrior king, this scarred and battle-hardened alpha, shaking like a pup before her. It wasn't. A knock at the door shattered the moment. Eric pulled back, his expression hardening into the mask of the Alpha King as Garrett entered. "Forgive the intrusion, my king." Garrett's eyes flicked to Freya with something that might have been respect. "But Shadowfang is demanding to invoke ancient right. He claims she," a nod toward Freya, "attacked him under parley. He's calling for trial by combat." Freya felt Eric's growl vibrate through his chest before she heard it. "He invaded my territory, broke into her chamber, threatened her life and the lives of her children. He claims he came peacefully and she attacked without provocation." Garrett's jaw was tight with frustration. "The other pack alphas who traveled with his army, they're demanding impartial judgment. If we execute him without trial, they'll call it murder. War will follow. Let it follow." Eric rose to his feet, lifting Freya with him as if she weighed nothing. "I will not let that creature live another day." "Wait." Freya's voice was quiet, but it cut through his rage like a blade. "There's another way." Both males turned to look at her. She squared her shoulders, feeling the dormant power still humming beneath her skin, exhausted but not extinguished. Something ancient whispered in her blood, memories that weren't quite her own, knowledge passed down through generations of Thornwood Lunas. "Luna's judgment," she said, "the ancient right of challenge. If an alpha commits an act of oath-breaking, murder under truce, the Luna who was wronged can call for divine judgment." Eric's face went pale. "Freya, no. The risk." "What risk?" She met his gaze steadily. "I'm the injured party. Rowan was my husband, killed under Magnus's truce flag. I have the right to challenge him directly." "You're 6 months pregnant." His voice cracked on the words. "If you face him in combat." "It's not that kind of combat." The knowledge was flowing now, clear and certain, a river of ancestral wisdom she hadn't known she possessed. Luna's judgment isn't about physical strength. It's about truth, about pack magic recognizing who is righteous and who is oathbreaker. She placed her hand over her heart. I know what he did. The magic will know what he did. And when it does, his own crimes will condemn him. Garrett was staring at her with something like wonder. The old rites. I thought they were myth. They're not. Freya drew a deep breath. They've simply been forgotten because no Luna has wielded the Thornwood power in 3 generations. The last few Lunas found their mates in peaceful times, never facing threats dire enough to call forth what slept in their blood. But I am Thornwood. I have found my fated bond, and Magnus has given me all the threat I need. Her voice hardened. I am done running. She looked up at Eric, at the fear and pride warring in his amber eyes. Let me do this. Let me be the one to end him. For Rowan. For my children. She reached up to touch his scarred cheek. For us. For a long moment he didn't speak. Then slowly, he nodded. Together, he said. Whatever happens, we face it together. They assembled at dawn in the great courtyard of Ashford Fortress. The morning air was bitter cold, frost glittering on the stones, but Freya felt warm, the silver power simmering just beneath her skin, waiting to be called. Eric stood at her left, close enough that she could feel his heat, and behind her ranged the wolves of the Ashford pack, silent and watchful. Across the courtyard, Magnus stood in chains between 2 guards. His face was a mask of barely contained rage, but his eyes were afraid. Freya could see it now, could smell it on him beneath the smoke and blood and rot. He was terrified of what she had become. Good. The visiting alphas had formed a semicircle to one side, neutral observers, theoretically, though Freya noted how several of them kept casting nervous glances at Eric's warriors. Whatever happened here today, they knew better than to interfere with an Alpha King's justice in his own territory. Freya Thornwood. Elder Marcus, the same wolf who had sneered at her just days ago, now spoke with grave formality. You have invoked the ancient right of Luna's judgment. Do you understand what you claim? I do. Her voice rang clear across the courtyard. I claim that Magnus Shadowfang is Oathbreaker and Kinslayer. That he murdered my mate Rowan under a flag of truce. That he hunted me for 3 moons while I carried these children. That he came into this territory with the intent to kill my unborn and take me by force. She let the silver power rise to the surface, felt it gleam in her eyes like moonlight. I call upon the pack magic to witness my truth. Magnus lurched forward against his chains. Lies. All lies. She was promised to me. She belongs to me. I was never yours. Freya's voice cut through his protests, resonant with ancestral authority. The bond didn't recognize you because there was no bond. You were an arrangement made by my father, nothing more. And when I found my true mate, you couldn't stand that I had chosen someone else. Someone better. Better? Magnus's face contorted with fury. That pathetic. Rowan was kind. The power was building now, spiraling upward from somewhere deep in her core. He was gentle and good, and he loved me. He would have been a wonderful father. Her voice broke, but she forced herself to continue. And you killed him, because you couldn't accept that I didn't want you. The silver light burst from her skin, brighter than before. Stronger than before. It spread across the courtyard like a tide, washing over everyone present, and where it touched Magnus, he screamed. By the ancient pact between pack and magic, Freya intoned, the words flowing from her lips as if spoken by every Thornwood Luna who had come before. I call for judgment. Let the truth be known. Let the Oathbreaker be revealed. The magic seized Magnus like a fist, his chains shattered. Not because he had broken free, but because the silver light was lifting him, holding him suspended as images began to form in the air around him. Memories made visible, truth made manifest. Every wolf in the courtyard saw what Freya had lived through. Rowan walking toward Magnus's camp under the white banner of truce. Magnus's smile, welcoming, treacherous. The blade that came from nowhere, plunging into Rowan's heart before he could even shift. His blood on the snow. His last breath. Whispering Freya's name. They saw Freya running through the frozen forest alone and pregnant and terrified. They saw Magnus's hunters closing in, howling for blood. They saw 3 moons of terror, of hiding, of desperate survival. And they saw Magnus in her chamber, glass crunching beneath his boots, promising to kill her children and force new pups into her belly. When the visions faded, silence hung over the courtyard like a shroud. You killed him under truce. Freya's voice was steel and ice. You are Oathbreaker. You are Kinslayer. And by the ancient right of Luna's judgment, I condemn you. Magnus crashed to the stones as the silver light released him. He scrambled to his feet, wild-eyed, desperate, and launched himself at Freya with claws extended and teeth bared. Eric was faster. The Alpha King intercepted Magnus mid-leap, his own claws tearing through flesh and sinew. They crashed to the ground in a tangle of limbs and fury, but Eric's size and strength were overwhelming. Within moments, he had Magnus pinned beneath him, one massive hand wrapped around the other wolf's throat. Wait! Freya's command froze them both. She walked forward slowly, each step measured, until she stood looking down at the male who had destroyed her life. Magnus's eyes rolled up to meet hers, and she saw it clearly now. Not just fear, but terror. The terror of a bully who had finally met something he couldn't break. You killed a good man, she said softly, because you couldn't stand that I chose him over you. Because your pride couldn't bear the rejection. Because in your twisted mind, I was property to be claimed, not a person to be loved. Please. The word came out as a whimper. Please, Freya, I'll leave. I'll never. You threatened my children. Her voice hardened. You said you would kill them, called them abominations, promised to put proper pups in me as if I were breeding stock. Magnus had no answer for that. Freya looked at Eric, at her mate. At the male who had shown her that protection could come with gentleness, that strength could serve instead of dominate. He was waiting, she realized. Waiting for her decision. Letting her reclaim the power that Magnus had tried to strip away. For Rowan, she said, for my children, for every wolf he's terrorized and every oath he's broken. She met Magnus's gaze one final time. I was never yours, and I never would have been. She nodded. Eric's claws tore through Magnus's throat in a single, merciful strike. It was over in an instant. Faster than Magnus deserved, perhaps, but Freya found she didn't want to prolong it. She didn't want to become the monster he had been. She just wanted it to end. And now it had. The visiting alphas bowed their heads, acknowledging the judgment. Magnus's remaining warriors, those who had survived the confrontation, dropped to their knees in submission. The threat was ended. The Oathbreaker was dead. And Freya stood in the blood-stained courtyard with silver light still streaming from her skin, and felt, for the first time in 3 moons, like she might actually be safe. Eric rose, covered in Magnus's blood, and crossed to her in 3 strides. He cupped her face in his gore-stained hands, heedless of the watching crowd, and pressed his forehead to hers. It's over, he breathed. It's finally over. Almost. She looked up at him, at the scars that crossed his face, at the amber eyes that had watched over her since the day she arrived at his gates. There's one more thing. The hours that followed were a blur of formality. Magnus's body burned on a pyre outside the walls, the Coalition Alphas dismissed with cold courtesy and stern warnings, Freya examined by Helga, who pronounced her exhausted but whole. The pack elders offered their formal apologies for doubting her. The warriors who had fought beside Eric bowed their heads in respect as she passed. But through it all, one thought burned in her mind, and she saw it reflected in Eric's eyes every time their gazes met. That night they stood alone in Eric's chamber, a room she had never entered before, austere and spare, dominated by a massive bed draped in dark furs. Candles flickered on every surface, casting dancing shadows across the walls, and the fire in the hearth crackled with warmth. Freya's heart was pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. The twins were quiet for once, as if they understood the gravity of what was about to happen. Her wolf was pacing inside her, eager, desperate, keening with a need that had been building since the moment she first opened her eyes to find Eric watching over her. "You don't have to do this." His voice was rough, his eyes tracking her every movement. "We can wait until after the children are born. Until you've had time to—" "I've had time." She crossed to him, placed her palm flat against his chest, felt the thunder of his heart beneath her fingers. 3 moons of running, 3 moons of grief, 3 moons of being so afraid I could barely breathe. She looked up into his face, at the scars he'd hidden behind for so many years. "I don't want to be afraid anymore. I want to be yours. I want you to be mine." A sound escaped him, something between a growl and a groan, and his hands came up to frame her face, tilting her head back so he could look directly into her eyes. "The children." "Doi," he said. "Rowan's children. I want you to know, they will be mine, in every way that matters. I will raise them, protect them, love them as if they came from my own blood. They will be Ashford heirs, and anyone who says otherwise will answer to me." Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she didn't bother to wipe them away. "Eric, I mean it." His thumb brushed away a tear, impossibly gentle for such a large male. "I know I can never replace what you lost. I know Rowan was your first love, your first mate. But if you'll let me, I will spend the rest of my life trying to deserve you." She rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his. Their first real kiss, soft and sweet and aching with promise. He responded with a tenderness that made her chest hurt, one hand sliding into her hair while the other settled carefully at the small of her back, mindful of her swollen belly. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, his eyes had gone molten gold. The wolf was close to the surface now, straining against his control. "I want to mark you." The words were rough, almost desperate. "I've wanted it since the moment I saw you. But only if you're sure. Only if you—" "I'm sure." She reached up to brush her fingers along the junction of his neck and shoulder, the place where her bite would go, where her claim would be written in his flesh for all to see. "I want to feel you through the bond. I want everyone to know that the Alpha King belongs to me." He made that sound again, that growl groan, and then his mouth was on her throat, trailing kisses along her jaw, down the column of her neck, to the sensitive spot where her pulse fluttered. "Tell me if it's too much," he murmured against her skin. "Tell me if you need me to stop." "I won't." She tilted her head back, baring her throat completely. "I need this. I need you." His teeth grazed her skin once, twice, and then he bit down. Pain lanced through her, sharp and bright and consuming, but it lasted only a moment before transforming into something else entirely. Pleasure flooded her veins, hot and liquid and overwhelming, and she felt the bond snap into place with a force that stole her breath. She could feel him, not just his body pressed against hers, but his essence, his strength, and his fears and his desperate, aching love for her. She felt the loneliness he'd carried for years, the walls he'd built around his heart, the terror that he wasn't worthy of the prophecy's promise. And beneath it all, she felt his wonder at finding her, his fierce protectiveness of her and the children she carried, his absolute certainty that he would burn the world to ashes if it meant keeping her safe. "Mine," she thought, and felt his answering surge of joy. When he finally released her, his tongue laving gently over the wound to seal it, she was trembling. But she wasn't done. "My turn," she whispered. He stilled. "Freya, you're my mate." She pushed gently at his chest until he sat on the edge of the bed, putting them closer to eye level. "You don't get to mark me and not bear my mark in return." For a long moment he simply stared at her. Then, Slowly, deliberately, he tilted his head to the side, baring the scarred column of his throat. An alpha king, offering his most vulnerable point to her. Freya leaned in, pressed her lips to his pulse point, felt his sharp inhale as her teeth grazed his skin. The power was still humming in her veins, quieter now, satisfied. But it rose again as she bit down, as her teeth pierced his flesh and his blood flooded her mouth, tasting of pine and storm and something wild and eternal. The bond flared brighter, a two-way river of sensation and emotion. She felt his pleasure, his pain, his absolute surrender to this moment, to her. She felt his wolf howling with triumph, with belonging, with the finally of a creature who had waited so long for its mate. Mine, she breathed against his throat as she sealed the wound. Always. Yours. His arms came around her, pulling her into his lap with exquisite care. Only yours, my Luna, my queen, my heart. They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped around each other, the bond singing between them like a living thing. Freya rested her head against his chest and listened to his heartbeat, steady and strong, as solid as the mountains that ringed his territory. I love you, she said, the words coming easier than she'd expected. I didn't think I could feel this way again. After Rowan, I thought that part of me was dead. Eric pressed a kiss to her hair. You loved him. You'll always love him. That's not a betrayal of what we have. It's proof that you know how to love completely. His hand settled over her belly, where the twins were stirring again, responding to the waves of emotion flowing through the bond. These children will know their father was a good man, and they'll know that their mother is the strongest, bravest wolf I've ever met. Freya smiled, her eyes drifting closed. For the first time since Rowan's death, she felt truly at peace. The coronation took place a fortnight later, after Freya had recovered from the events at the courtyard and the pack had had time to prepare for the celebration. She stood before the assembled wolves of both Ashford and the surrendered Thornwood territories, now united under Eric's rule, dressed in a gown of silver and midnight blue, the colors of her new pack. Eric placed the circlet on her head himself, his hands steady, his eyes shining with pride. I present to you Freya Ashford, Luna Queen of the Northern Territories, bearer of the Thornwood legacy, and my mate in all things. The howl that rose from the crowd shook the very walls. Freya felt it in her bones, in her blood, in the bond that connected her to every wolf who had accepted her as their Luna. She was home. The twins came 2 moons later on a night of howling wind and driving snow. A boy and a girl, healthy and strong, with their father's dark hair and their mother's silver-gray eyes. Eric was there through every moment of the labor, holding Freya's hand, murmuring words of encouragement, catching his son and daughter as they entered the world. They're perfect, he breathed, cradling the tiny girl against his massive chest while Freya nursed the boy. Absolutely perfect. They're ours, Freya said, and she meant it. Not just biologically, though the truth of that didn't matter anymore, but in every way that counted. These children would grow up surrounded by love, protected by a father who had chosen them, part of a pack that had accepted them without reservation. Rowan would be proud, she thought, and somehow she knew it was true. The years that followed were kinder than any Freya had dared to imagine. She ruled beside Eric as Luna Queen, her power growing stronger with time and practice, until she could call upon the Thornwood legacy as easily as breathing. The twins, named Rowan for their birth father and Astrid for Eric's mother, grew tall and strong, beloved by the entire pack. And 2 years after their birth, their baby sister arrived, Eric's biological daughter, with her father's amber eyes and her mother's stubborn chin. The twins fought over who got to hold her first, eventually compromising by sitting on either side of Freya's bed and taking turns. She's so small, Rowan Jr. said, wonder in his voice. She'll get bigger, Astrid informed him with the authority of a sister who was older by all of 3 minutes. And then she'll steal your toys. Eric laughed, a sound that still made Freya's heart skip, even after years of hearing it. He scooped up both twins, settling one on each hip, and leaned down to kiss his mate's forehead. "Thank you," he murmured against her skin, "for finding me, for staying, for giving me everything I never knew I needed." Freya looked up at him, her scarred king, her fierce protector, her heart, and smiled. "Thank you for seeing me, for protecting me, for loving children that weren't yours as if they'd come from your own blood. They are mine," he said simply. "Just as you are. Just as this little one is." He touched the baby's cheek, his massive finger almost comically large against her tiny face. "My family. My pack. My home." Outside the window, the first spring flowers were blooming, painting the courtyard in shades of purple and gold. The winter was finally over, in more ways than one, and as Freya settled back against her pillows, surrounded by her children and her mate, the bond humming with contentment between them, she knew that she had found what she'd been running toward all along. Not just safety, not just survival, but love. True, unconditional, eternal love. And she would never run again.